Sarah had not been back to the naval base in many years. The memories of her time there were vivid, yet distant. Like an old photograph she could still see clearly in her mind. Today, she walked through the gates, her footsteps echoing softly on the concrete path, each step bringing back fragments of her past. Training drills in the early mornings, long nights spent in strategy meetings, and the laughter of her fellow officers during rare moments of downtime. She felt a mix of nostalgia and nervous anticipation. Her uniform was crisp, her posture straight, and every movement showed the discipline that had been ingrained in her over years of service. Yet, beneath her sleeve, the edge of a tattoo peeked out. It wasn't just any tattoo. It was a piece of her story, inked years ago during a deployment overseas, a symbol of both personal struggle and courage. It was her private badge of honor, one that reminded her daily of the missions she had survived and the friends she had lost. As she walked deeper into the base, she noticed that some of the younger sailors and officers were staring at her. At first, she tried to ignore them, focusing on the rhythm of her steps and the familiar sights around her. But it was impossible to ignore the whispers that began circulating, soft at first but growing louder as she moved along. "They really let anyone back here these days?" one junior officer whispered, smirking. "Look at that tattoo. Does she even know she's in uniform?" Another laughed quietly. Sarah felt a flicker of irritation, but she didn't let it show. She had learned long ago that reactions like this were not unusual when you returned to a place that had changed since your last visit. She remembered her first days on the base, how she herself had laughed at the more decorated, older officers without understanding the meaning behind their experiences. Now it was her turn. The tattoo, though partially hidden, seemed to draw more attention than she expected. She realized that, to these younger officers, it was a symbol they didn't understand. It was different, unusual, something they weren't used to seeing on someone in a naval uniform. She could almost hear the questions forming in their minds. Who is she? Why is that there? Does it matter at all? Despite the whispers and sideways glances, Sarah moved with calm confidence. She had faced far greater challenges than awkward stares and idle gossip. During her deployments, she had endured storms, navigated treacherous terrain, and made decisions under pressure that could mean life or death for her team. These stares and whispers, was nothing compared to the battles she had already survived. Still, the situation was not without its sting. Human nature made her aware of the judgment in their eyes, and it reminded her that not everyone could see past appearances. She thought about how easy it was for people to assume they understood someone's story from a glance, a uniform, or even a tattoo. She wondered how many of them would ever truly understand what courage, sacrifice, and service looked like in real life. Sarah paused for a moment near the center of the base, where the courtyard opened up, revealing the old training grounds. She remembered countless drills and exercises here, the way her team had once pushed each other to limits they didn't know they could reach. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs, grounding herself in the memories and the knowledge that she belonged here, no matter what the whispers said. A few more officers had gathered nearby, their expressions a mix of curiosity and amusement. They were clearly trying to gauge her reaction, perhaps hoping to see her embarrassed or flustered. But Sarah had learned long ago that confidence and composure were more powerful than any sarcastic remark. She held her head high, each movement precise and measured, as if to silently say, "I know who I am, and I know my worth." It wasn't long before one of the more audacious junior officers called out something under his breath, attempting to provoke a reaction. Sarah didn't respond, though inside, she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that she could handle this with grace. Years of experience had taught her that respect was earned, and it wasn't given lightly to those who only saw the surface. As she continued walking toward the administrative building, Sarah's mind wandered to the purpose of her visit. She had returned for a meeting with some of the base's senior officers to discuss ongoing operations and share insights from her recent missions abroad. But she also realized, with a small smile, that she was about to teach the younger officers an unspoken lesson. Sometimes, appearances could be deceiving, and wisdom often came from those who had walked the toughest paths. Even as she reached the steps of the main building, she felt a strange mix of anticipation and calm. The whispers followed her like a low hum, but Sarah paid them no mind. Her focus was on the bigger picture. The mission, the people she would meet, and the chance to reconnect with the place that had shaped so much of her life. The tattoo on her arm, which had drawn laughter and curious glances, was now a quiet statement of her identity. An invisible shield, a reminder that she had survived, thrived, and earned every bit of her place here. And so, with steady steps and unwavering composure, Sarah walked forward, ready to face whatever awaited her inside, confident that respect, like courage, was something that revealed itself in time, not something demanded from the faint-hearted or the unobservant. As Sarah moved further into the base, the whispers and stares from the junior officers grew louder. What had started as curious glances now became full-blown amusement. Some of them could not hide their smirks, exchanging quiet jokes and glances, clearly enjoying themselves at her expense. It was clear that her tattoo had become the center of attention, though Sarah had no intention of making it a spectacle. "She actually thinks she belongs here," one young sailor whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. Another officer chuckled and leaned over, pointing subtly to the ink on her arm. "Look at that. Does she even know what she's doing?" The laughter was quiet but unmistakable. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, scanning her from head to toe, as if trying to figure out whether someone like her had the right to wear the uniform with pride. For a moment, she paused, feeling a familiar sting that came not from the words themselves but from the arrogance behind them. These young officers had no idea of the journeys she had been through, the hardships she had faced, or the victories she had earned. To them, the tattoo was just something unusual, something different, and anything different was automatically strange, amusing, or even laughable. Sarah remembered her own days as a young officer, when she too had been quick to judge. She knew that mockery often came from ignorance, insecurity, or a lack of experience. It wasn't personal, but it was real, and she could feel it now like an invisible barrier trying to push her out. Despite the discomfort, Sarah stood tall. Her posture, calm and confident, reflected the discipline she had cultivated over years of service. She had learned that showing irritation or anger rarely changed people's minds. It only gave them the reaction they wanted. Instead, she decided to let her presence speak louder than their words ever could. Her uniform was immaculate, her demeanor poised, and her eyes steady. She carried herself with the same quiet authority that had helped her lead teams in the most dangerous situations abroad. She continued walking, her pace measured and deliberate. Each step was a reminder to herself that she belonged here, no matter what the whispers suggested. The tattoo on her arm wasn't meant for them to understand. It was a personal mark of her courage and resilience. It represented moments in her life that had tested her in ways these young officers could not yet imagine. Missions in hostile territories, nights spent worrying for the safety of her team, and the sacrifices she had made to protect others. It wasn't ink on skin. It was history, memory, and honor etched onto her. As she moved deeper into the courtyard, the laughter became more noticeable. Some of the younger officers nudged each other and whispered loudly enough for others to hear. Sarah could hear snide comments like, "Who even does this?" And "maybe she thinks she's cool now." The words were meant to sting, to diminish her, but they had the opposite effect. Instead of feeling hurt, Sarah felt a quiet resolve growing inside her. She realized that the laughter was not about her tattoo. It was about their limited understanding. They had yet to experience the world, the responsibilities, and the dangers that had shaped her. At that moment, she decided that she wouldn't explain anything to them. There was no need. Their understanding wasn't important right now. What mattered was that she remained true to herself, composed, and proud. She had faced real challenges that these junior officers could only read about in books or hear in stories. Their amusement was fleeting. Her achievements were permanent. Sarah also noticed that not everyone was laughing. A few of the slightly older officers watched silently, observing the scene with quiet curiosity. They didn't say anything, but their eyes seemed to acknowledge her history and experience. It reminded her that respect was not always loud. It was often quiet, subtle, and earned over time. As she continued toward the administrative building, She reflected on the irony of the situation. Here she was, back in a place she had once called home, being judged by people who had barely scratched the surface of what service meant. The tattoo, which had become a point of ridicule, was actually a symbol of everything she had accomplished, the missions she had led, the lives she had protected, and the challenges she had overcome. It was proof that experience and courage cannot be measured by age or appearance. Despite the mocking, Sarah found herself smiling inwardly. She had been through far worse than a few sarcastic remarks or sideways glances. She had faced storms at sea, life-threatening missions, and moments where decisions had to be made in seconds. Compared to that, this was a minor skirmish, a small test of patience and dignity. And like all tests she had faced, she intended to pass it with grace. By the time she reached the main building, the junior officer's laughter had slowed, replaced with curiosity and, in some cases, awkward silence. Sarah didn't need to confront them. Her presence alone had begun to speak volumes. She was not the same person they thought she was. She was stronger, wiser, and unshakable. And deep down, she knew that the day would come when they would understand the meaning behind her tattoo. Not because she told them, but because respect for courage and service reveals itself eventually. Sarah walked into the building, her head held high, ignoring the last whispers behind her. Every step felt like a small victory. The laughter of the inexperienced would fade, but her accomplishments and resilience were permanent. The tattoo, once a source of amusement for some, quietly carried her story, her battles, and her pride. An invisible shield that nothing could tarnish. As Sarah walked through the familiar paths of the naval base, her mind began to drift back to the past. The courtyard, the barracks, the old training fields, all of it was alive with memories. She could almost hear the echoes of drills and commands, the shouts of fellow sailors, and the laughter that had once filled the air. The tattoo on her arm, which had drawn whispers and smirks from the younger officers, suddenly felt like a bridge between her past and present. It wasn't just ink. It was a living story, a reminder of everything she had faced and overcome. The tattoo had been something she had gotten during a deployment overseas. It wasn't a decorative choice or a casual whim. Each line and symbol had meaning. It represented the missions she had survived, the teammates she had lost, and the moments when life had hung by a fragile thread. Sarah remembered the long nights in the field, when the world felt dark and uncertain, and the only thing keeping her going was her sense of duty and the knowledge that her team relied on her. Every time she looked at the tattoo, she remembered those moments, the fear, the tension, but also the courage and camaraderie that had seen them through. As she continued, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because she had survived, thrived, and returned to a place that had shaped her life. Sadness because she thought of those who had not returned, her comrades whose names were etched into the memory of that tattoo. It was a reminder that every choice in the field carried weight, and every success had come at a cost. The younger officers around her didn't know any of this. To them, it was just a tattoo, a strange design on an older officer. They laughed, whispered, and stared, completely unaware of the story behind it. Sarah understood that. She remembered being young and naive once, judging people by appearances rather than understanding their experiences. Now she felt a quiet patience. The story behind her tattoo didn't need to be explained. It would speak for itself eventually in its own way to those who were ready to see it. Her mind wandered further back to the actual day she had gotten it. She had been on a mission that had tested everything she knew about leadership, strategy, and endurance. They had faced impossible odds, navigating treacherous terrain and unpredictable conditions. The tattoo had been both a reward and a reminder, a permanent mark that commemorated what they had endured together. Each time she raised her arm, she wasn't just showing a symbol. She was honoring those experiences, those bonds, and the lessons she had learned. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted briefly by another whispered comment from a junior officer. This time, she didn't even register it. Her mind was fully absorbed in memory. She thought about the moments during her service when she had doubted herself, when the fear of failure had been almost paralyzing. And yet, she had pushed forward, relying on skill, training, and trust in her team. Those memories gave her a strength that no mockery could shake. She also reflected on the irony of returning to a place where she had once been young and impressionable, now coming back as someone seasoned and experienced. She realized that respect and understanding were often earned slowly, through action and demonstration, rather than demanded. The laughter of the younger officers, fleeting as it was, could not touch the years of dedication and courage that her tattoo represented. Walking past the old training field, Sarah remembered a particular night on deployment. The team had been surrounded, low on supplies, and unsure if they would make it back safely. It was in those moments, she remembered, that she had learned what true courage meant. Not just physical bravery, but mental resilience, leadership, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. Every part of her tattoo reminded her of those lessons, each symbol a story of survival, teamwork, and determination. Even now, standing in the middle of the naval base, she felt the power of those memories. The whispers from the juniors seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Sarah realized that the tattoo wasn't just her story. It was a statement about strength, sacrifice, and the invisible burdens carried by those who serve. It wasn't meant for them to understand immediately, and that was okay. One day they might look back and finally grasp the depth behind what they had mocked. Her eyes briefly scanned the courtyard, noting how the younger sailors had quieted a little. Perhaps they sensed the weight she carried, or maybe they were beginning to realize that appearances could be deceiving. Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction. She didn't need to say a word. The tattoo itself, the history behind it, and the confident way she carried herself were already teaching a lesson about courage, respect, and resilience. By the time she reached the administrative building, Sarah's reflections had strengthened her resolve. She knew that mockery and whispers would not define her. The tattoo, once a source of judgment from others, had become a personal emblem of triumph and memory. It reminded her of every challenge she had faced, every risk she had taken, and every life she had fought to protect. And as she entered the building, stepping into the present while carrying the past on her arm, Sarah felt a calm confidence. The tattoo was no longer just a mark of the past. It was a silent declaration of who she was and what she had endured. The laughter outside, the curious stares, the mockery, they all faded into the background. What mattered was the story behind the ink, the strength she carried, and the respect that would eventually come, earned not through explanation, but through life, action, and example. As Sarah continued her walk across the naval base, the atmosphere around her began to shift subtly. The junior officers who had been whispering and laughing were now starting to notice something different in her demeanor. There was a quiet authority about her, a calm confidence that made it clear she had faced challenges far beyond anything they had ever experienced. It was this presence that caught the attention of one of the senior officers stationed nearby. Lieutenant Commander Harris, a man known for his fairness and sharp judgment, had been observing the scene from a distance. He had seen the subtle mockery aimed at Sarah, and he recognized it for what it was, immaturity and ignorance rather than malice. He walked over purposefully, his polished boots clicking against the concrete as he approached her. When he reached Sarah, he nodded respectfully, a quiet acknowledgment of her rank and presence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm, "I think some of our younger sailors don't understand the situation here." Sarah gave a small, appreciative smile. She had expected as much. After all, the whispers and laughter had been clear signs that some of the junior crew members were not used to seeing someone like her. Someone seasoned, accomplished, and visibly proud of her experiences, returning to the base. "It's all right," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "They're just curious. They don't know the story behind this." Her hand brushed lightly against the sleeve covering part of her tattoo, as if instinctively guarding the symbol of her past triumphs and sacrifices. Lieutenant Commander Harris glanced at the tattoo, his expression shifting from curiosity to understanding. "I see," he said softly. "Would you mind explaining it? I want to make sure they know its significance." Sarah paused, considering his suggestion. She hadn't planned to lecture anyone today. Her tattoo was personal, a private reminder of her service and the moments that had tested her courage. But she also realized that sharing a glimpse of the story might teach the junior officers a valuable lesson. One about respect, history, and the meaning behind symbols they often judged too quickly. She nodded. "Very well," she said, "but only briefly. There's a lot of context they won't understand until they've experienced it themselves." She began to recount the story behind the tattoo, her voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. She spoke of her deployment overseas, of nights when the team had been surrounded in hostile territory, and of moments when split-second decisions had determined life or death. She told of her team's courage and sacrifices, of the hardships they endured, and of the invisible burdens that every service member carries. The tattoo, she explained, was a mark of all these experiences, a symbol of survival, teamwork, and honor. As she spoke, the whispers that had followed her earlier faded into silence. The junior officers, who had been so quick to mock, now listened with a mixture of awe and reflection. Sarah's story wasn't just about ink on skin. It was about real life, real sacrifice, and the reality of service that many had only read about in textbooks or heard in passing. They began to realize that what they had laughed at was, in fact, a testament to courage and resilience. Lieutenant Commander Harris watched closely as the young sailors absorbed her words. He could see the change in their expressions, the shift from amusement to respect, from ignorance to understanding. "This is exactly why we need to remember history and respect experience," he said quietly to himself. Then he turned to the juniors and added, "What you see here is more than a tattoo. It's a story of leadership, bravery, and commitment that none of us should take lightly." Sarah continued, sharing small anecdotes from her missions that were both harrowing and inspiring. She spoke of navigating dangerous terrains, coordinating complex operations, and making decisions that saved lives. With each story, she didn't just illustrate the meaning behind the tattoo. She conveyed the essence of what it meant to serve with honor and integrity. The junior officers were captivated. Some had their eyes widened in surprise, while others nodded slowly, absorbing every word. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a quiet reflection that seemed to hang over the group. After a few minutes, Sarah concluded her explanation, letting the silence speak for itself. She didn't need to demand respect. It had been earned through her actions, her history, and the authenticity of her words. The lesson had been delivered gently but powerfully, demonstrating that understanding often comes from listening and observing rather than judging superficially. The senior officer nodded approvingly. "Thank you, ma'am. That was exactly what they needed to hear." He glanced at the juniors, who now stood straighter, their previous smugness replaced by a tentative humility. Sarah felt a small sense of satisfaction, knowing that the story behind her tattoo had begun to open their eyes. She hadn't just shared her past. She had given them a glimpse of what true service looks like, the kind that isn't measured by appearances, rank, or casual judgment, but by courage, sacrifice, and the quiet resilience of those who dedicate their lives to something greater than themselves. As Sarah moved on toward the main building, she felt the weight of the moment linger. The laughter was gone, replaced by thoughtful silence and, in some cases, quiet admiration. The junior officers had been reminded that appearances can be deceiving, and that every symbol carries a story deeper than what meets the eye. And in that moment, Sarah understood that sharing her story, briefly but meaningfully, had already started to change their perspective. With each step, she carried herself with the same calm authority she had shown from the moment she arrived. Her tattoo, once the subject of ridicule, now seemed to radiate quiet strength. She knew the lesson would not be forgotten quickly. The junior officers had seen courage, resilience, and dedication in its truest form, and it had come not from rank or position, but from experience, character, and the quiet confidence of someone who had truly lived through what they could only imagine. The whispers and awkward glances of the junior officers had barely settled when a new presence made itself known across the courtyard. Sarah had felt it even before she saw him, a shift in the atmosphere that demanded attention and respect. The commanding general of the base had arrived. His reputation preceded him, a man of authority, discipline, and sharp insight who rarely tolerated disrespect or frivolity. The instant he appeared, the younger officer's laughter faltered, replaced by a mixture of tension, curiosity, and unease. Sarah noticed the change immediately. The energy around her shifted from casual amusement to something far more serious. Junior officers straightened their posture, hands twitching nervously at their sides, while the older, more experienced crew members exchanged quiet, knowing glances. It was as if the very air in the courtyard had thickened with the weight of authority. Even the sunlight seemed to reflect more sharply off polished boots and the edges of uniforms. The general's gaze swept the area, sharp and calculating. He could sense the dynamics instantly, the hierarchy, the whispers, and most importantly, the presence of someone who commanded respect without having to demand it. His eyes locked on Sarah, standing calmly amid the silent whispers of junior sailors. She did not flinch, smile nervously, or avert her gaze. She simply met his eyes steadily, exuding the quiet confidence that had marked her throughout her career. A few of the junior officers shifted uneasily under the general's piercing stare. The playful bravado they had displayed moments ago evaporated instantly. One officer, who had been leaning against a railing, suddenly straightened, his face paling as the general's attention seemed to weigh down upon him. The realization hit them all. The presence of someone so high-ranking could instantly change the tone of any situation. The general approached slowly, deliberately. Each step carried authority and experience, and it was clear that his attention was fully on Sarah. When he finally reached her, the courtyard seemed to quiet even further, as if everyone present could sense the significance of this encounter. There was no need for introductions. The general's reputation and Sarah's standing spoke for themselves. He studied her for a moment, taking in her posture, her uniform, and the partially hidden tattoo on her arm. To him, it was immediately clear that she was no ordinary officer. There was a depth to her presence, a silent confidence that indicated experience, courage, and resilience. He had seen many officers in his career, but very few carried such quiet authority with humility. He nodded slightly, a subtle but profound acknowledgment of her achievements and status. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice calm yet commanding, carrying across the courtyard with clarity. "Welcome back." The words struck like a sudden burst of clarity through the hushed murmurs of the juniors. It was a simple greeting, yet it carried enormous weight. It was more than just politeness, it was recognition, acknowledgement, and respect rolled into one. Every sailor present could feel the difference between a casual welcome and one that honored a lifetime of service, sacrifice, and leadership. The junior officers, who had moments before been laughing and mocking, froze. Their mouths opened slightly, and their eyes widened. Some stared at the general in shock, then at Sarah, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The energy of mockery that had filled the courtyard moments ago had completely dissipated, replaced by awe and a budding respect. It was a silent but powerful lesson. Courage, experience, and commitment cannot be mocked, because they command recognition when it matters most. Sarah felt a quiet warmth at the acknowledgement, but she remained composed. She did not smile broadly or bow. She simply returned the general's nod with steady eyes and a subtle, respectful inclination of her head. In that simple gesture, the courtyard understood that she had earned her place, her respect, and her authority. It was not the title or rank alone that mattered. It was the life she had lived and the battles she had endured. The general's presence had not only silenced the junior officers, but also shifted their understanding. They began to realize that their laughter, their judgment, had been premature. They were witnessing the impact of real leadership and experience, embodied in someone who had returned not to boast, but to serve, share knowledge, and fulfill her duty. The courtyard was now quiet, the younger officers reflecting on the stark contrast between arrogance and earned respect. Sarah's tattoo, once a source of curiosity and ridicule, now seemed almost sacred in the eyes of those present. The symbol that had drawn jokes earlier was now part of a larger story they could begin to comprehend. It wasn't the ink that commanded attention. It was the life it represented, the courage it symbolized, and the resilience it reminded everyone of. Even as the general's words lingered in the air, the courtyard felt transformed. The junior officers had learned, in moments, what it sometimes took years to understand. That respect is not demanded through force or mockery. It is recognized when history, sacrifice, and character speak louder than appearances. And Sarah, standing silently yet powerfully in the midst of it all, had become the living embodiment of that lesson. As the general moved on, continuing his inspection of the base, Sarah remained composed, fully aware of the impact of the moment. She had not sought attention or admiration, yet the respect had been given freely, earned by a life of dedication and courage. And for the first time that day, she felt an unspoken connection with the junior officers. Not of fear, but of understanding, a quiet seed of realization that would grow over time. The words "Ma'am, welcome back," echoed through the courtyard, leaving an immediate impact on everyone present. It was as though the entire atmosphere had shifted in a single moment. The junior officers who had been laughing and whispering moments ago now stood in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe, embarrassment, and realization. The commanding general's simple greeting carried a weight far beyond polite words. It was recognition, respect, and validation all at once. Sarah felt the shift instantly. It wasn't just the general's authority that commanded attention. It was the acknowledgment of her service, her history, and the courage represented by the tattoo on her arm. Every moment she had endured in hostile environments, every decision she had made under pressure, every mission that had tested her limits, all of it was being silently honored in that one phrase. She straightened her posture slightly, not out of pride, but from the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her dedication had not gone unnoticed. The junior officers were struggling to process the scene. Some glanced at each other, unsure how to react. The bravado and laughter that had dominated their behavior had vanished completely, replaced by a sudden awareness of the difference between rank, experience, and earned respect. They had mocked without understanding, and now they were witnessing the undeniable proof that true courage and service could not be trivialized. Sarah looked around the courtyard, taking in the reactions of those who had ridiculed her earlier. She could see the subtle, almost imperceptible nods of acknowledgment forming on some of their faces. Others, still shocked, were wide-eyed and speechless, as if the weight of what they had learned was just beginning to settle in. The general had not needed to scold them or lecture them. His words alone had conveyed the lesson. Respect, it seemed, could be taught in silence through recognition and by highlighting the value of experience and integrity. As the moment stretched, Sarah felt a wave of reflection wash over her. She remembered the countless days of rigorous training, the missions overseas, and the countless hours she had spent ensuring the safety of her team. Each memory was tied to the tattoo that had initially drawn ridicule, the symbol of perseverance, sacrifice, and resilience. Now, it seemed as if that same tattoo had silently spoken to those who had once mocked it, its meaning finally acknowledged, if only partially, by the eyes of the general and the junior officers. Lieutenant Commander Harris, who had been observing the interaction, gave a small, approving nod. He understood the subtle power of this moment. The young officers needed to learn that true leadership, courage, and honor are often invisible to those who only see the surface. Mocking appearances, especially without understanding the story behind them, is a mistake that experience quickly teaches. And in that moment, Sarah's story, her life, her tattoo, and her presence, became a lesson in itself. Sarah's gaze met the eyes of a few of the younger officers. She did not scold them, nor did she demand acknowledgement. Instead, she allowed the weight of her history and the recognition from the general to speak for her. She could see the realization dawning slowly. They were beginning to understand, at least on some level, that courage, sacrifice, and achievement are earned and respected, not mocked. The courtyard remained quiet, the previous noise of whispers and laughter completely gone. Even the air seemed to have changed, carrying a newfound respect. Sarah noticed how differently the junior officers now held themselves, some straightening their backs, others quietly glancing at her and then away, perhaps ashamed of their earlier behavior. The power of acknowledgement, when given by someone who has truly earned it, was unmistakable. As the general moved on to inspect other parts of the base, Sarah continued to stand with quiet composure. She understood that her role in that moment was not just to return, but to exemplify the meaning of service, dedication, and resilience. The general's words had amplified the story she carried silently on her arm, and she could feel the ripple of respect spreading through the courtyard. The younger officers were beginning to realize that mocking someone without understanding their experiences was not just foolish, it was disrespectful. They saw the difference between someone who had earned every scar, every achievement, and someone who assumed they understood life from appearances alone. The lesson was clear. Respect is earned through action, character, and courage, not through superficial judgment. Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction. This moment, simple as it seemed, had changed the atmosphere entirely. The laughter and whispers had been replaced by acknowledgment, curiosity, and reflection. She didn't need to speak further. Her presence, combined with the general's recognition, had delivered the message more effectively than any words could. The courtyard had learned a lesson in humility, the kind that comes not from punishment, but from witnessing true integrity and honor firsthand. As she continued toward the main building, Sarah felt a sense of calm accomplishment. The recognition had done more than validate her service. It had subtly transformed the junior officers' understanding. They had been reminded that appearances can be deceiving, that courage and sacrifice are often invisible, and that respect must be given where it is truly due. The tattoo, once a source of amusement, now symbolized not only her past but also the respect she had earned in the present. Every step she took carried the confidence of someone who had survived, persevered, and now commanded silent respect. The general's words, "Ma'am, welcome back," would resonate in the minds of those junior officers for a long time, slowly teaching them the deeper lessons of honor, experience, and humility. And as Sarah walked on, she knew that the courtyard had witnessed something more than a simple greeting. It had witnessed a moment of earned respect, a recognition of courage, and a quiet lesson in the value of true service. After the general had spoken, a profound silence settled over the courtyard. The junior officers, who had only moments ago been whispering and laughing at Sarah's tattoo, now stood frozen. Some stared at her in disbelief, their faces a mix of confusion and awe. Others shifted nervously from foot to foot, realizing for the first time that their mockery had been not only inappropriate but also deeply disrespectful. Sarah's presence, combined with the general's acknowledgment, had created a shift that could not be ignored. It was as if the air itself had changed, carrying the unspoken weight of experience, courage, and honor. Sarah observed them quietly. She didn't need to speak to enforce the lesson. They were learning it through observation, reflection, and the undeniable reality of what the general's words had conveyed. She saw in their eyes the beginnings of understanding, the first glimmers of humility, and the realization that appearances can be deceptive. The tattoo they had mocked was not merely ink. It was a symbol of survival, sacrifice, and unspoken stories of battles fought far from their sight. A few of the junior officers exchanged glances, their initial amusement replaced by uncertainty. One young sailor, who had been particularly loud in his whispers, now looked down at the ground, avoiding eye contact. Another, who had smirked moments before, straightened his back and seemed to take a silent inventory of his behavior. Sarah noticed these subtle changes and recognized them as the earliest signs of reflection and growth. It was never easy to confront one's own ignorance, but the moment was already beginning to plant the seeds of respect. Sarah's mind wandered as she observed them. She thought about her own journey, the days of rigorous training, the missions overseas, the moments of fear, hope, and triumph that had shaped her into the officer she had become. Each memory was tied to the tattoo, the symbol that had drawn laughter yet now carried an aura of respect. She remembered times when she had doubted herself, faced impossible odds, and yet persevered because of discipline, courage, and the trust of her team. She realized that the juniors were witnessing, perhaps unconsciously, the embodiment of all those experiences. Lieutenant Commander Harris, who had been nearby, quietly observed as well. He could see the internal struggle on the faces of the younger officers, the clash between their prior assumptions and the reality they now faced. He knew that these lessons were far more powerful when learned through observation rather than lecture. Watching Sarah stand with quiet confidence, fully aware of the weight of her history, was a teaching moment that could not be replicated in a classroom. It was subtle yet transformative. Sarah also noted the body language of some of the slightly older officers. They had watched silently throughout the encounter, their expressions revealing a mixture of admiration and contemplation. They understood that respect is not given lightly, and that moments like these, where experience and courage are visibly acknowledged, carry lessons that echo far beyond the immediate situation. It was a reminder that leadership is often quiet, composed, and rooted in earned authority, rather than in loud commands or superficial displays of power. As the minutes passed, the juniors began to grasp, slowly, the broader significance of what they had witnessed. Their laughter had been replaced by reflection. Their curiosity and mockery had turned into quiet introspection. The story behind the tattoo, once invisible to them, was beginning to speak. A story of resilience, sacrifice, and the courage that underpins true service. It was a lesson that could not be hurried or forced, only observed, internalized, and eventually respected. Sarah allowed herself a quiet smile, not one of pride or arrogance, but one of understanding. She recognized that true lessons in humility and respect often take time to take root. The young officers had seen a glimpse of what it meant to dedicate oneself to service, to face challenges head-on, and to earn recognition through action and integrity. The general's words had magnified the lesson, but it was Sarah's presence, her history, and the quiet authority she carried that had made it tangible. She continued walking slowly toward the building, her gaze calm and measured, fully aware of the subtle impact she was having. She noticed a few juniors glancing at her tattoo with new curiosity, no longer mocking, but wondering about the story behind it. Others looked at her eyes, searching for a reaction, perhaps expecting anger or defensiveness, but they found none. She carried herself with dignity, demonstrating that courage and respect are shown through actions and composure, not through confrontation or words alone. The courtyard, once a space of whispers and laughter, had become a silent classroom. The junior officers were learning the hard lesson that judgment without understanding is shallow and often misguided. Sarah's life, her experiences, and the acknowledgment from the general had created a moment that would stay with them far longer than the fleeting amusement of mockery. By the time she entered the main building, Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction. She had not needed to speak loudly, argue, or correct anyone directly. The lesson had been learned in the most powerful way possible, through presence, experience, and earned recognition. The junior officers would carry the memory of this moment, slowly understanding that respect is not assumed, it is earned, and that appearances are often misleading. As the day continued, Sarah realized that her return to the base had not only been about her work or responsibilities, it had also been an opportunity to teach, subtly and effectively, a lesson in humility, respect, and the true meaning of service. The tattoo, once mocked, now symbolized not just her history, but the powerful impact that lived experience can have on those willing to observe and learn. The encounter would remain with the junior officers for a long time. They had witnessed courage, resilience, and honor firsthand, and the lesson was clear. Respect is earned through action, and judgment should never be passed without understanding. Sarah had quietly, without force or confrontation, shown them the depth of real service and the meaning behind the symbols that tell stories of dedication, sacrifice, and strength. By the time Sarah walked through the gates of the main building, a quiet had settled over the naval base. The earlier laughter, the mocking glances, and the whispers of the junior officers had vanished completely. They stood, many of them still in stunned silence, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. For them, the day had started as ordinary, perhaps even amusing, but it had transformed into a lesson that went far beyond appearances. Sarah's presence, combined with the recognition of the general, had left an impression that would linger far longer than any temporary mockery. Sarah moved steadily, her posture calm, her steps deliberate. She felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, not because of pride, but because she understood that the day had changed not only her own experience of returning to the base, but also the understanding of those who had judged her without knowing her story. Every glance at her tattoo, every whisper of amusement that had met her earlier, had now been replaced by curiosity, respect, and reflection. The symbol that had once been a point of ridicule had transformed into a mark of honor in the eyes of those around her. As she walked, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her back to this place. She remembered the missions overseas, the long nights spent ensuring the safety of her team, and the countless decisions made under pressure. She remembered the moments of fear, the uncertainty, and the incredible relief of surviving each challenge. All those experiences were embedded in the tattoo on her arm, a symbol that now carried not only personal significance but a silent lesson for those who had once mocked it. She glanced back briefly at the courtyard where the junior officers remained. Some were watching her with quiet interest. Others still seemed unsure how to react. Sarah knew that the lesson of the day would take time to fully sink in. Respect and understanding are rarely instantaneous. They grow slowly, often after reflection and experience. She felt confident that today's events had planted the first seeds. The juniors had learned, in their own way, that appearances are often misleading and that courage, experience, and service carry meanings that cannot be judged at first glance. Walking through the familiar hallways, Sarah could feel a sense of continuity between her past and present. The naval base had been a place of growth, training, and discovery for her, and now it had become a place of subtle education for others. She thought about how young officers often misinterpret symbols and achievements simply because they do not yet understand the weight behind them. Her tattoo, once a source of amusement for them, had now become a symbol of lessons learned, sacrifice recognized, and courage acknowledged. The senior officers and her colleagues greeted her with nods and smiles as she passed, recognizing not only her rank and authority, but also the quiet influence she carried. It was clear that Sarah had always commanded respect, not through loud gestures or demands, but through her presence, her history, and the depth of her experiences. Even the junior officers who had initially mocked her now began to notice these qualities. The shift in their perception was subtle but undeniable, and Sarah knew it would continue to influence their understanding long after today. As she entered the conference room for her meeting with the commanding staff, Sarah reflected on the importance of moments like this. The general's acknowledgment had amplified the lesson, but it was her own conduct, her calm confidence, and the story behind her tattoo that had made it truly impactful. The junior officers had not just witnessed authority, they had witnessed earned authority, the kind that comes from experience, sacrifice, and the quiet endurance of challenges faced and overcome. Sarah's mind wandered back to the lessons she herself had learned as a young officer. She remembered times when she had misunderstood others, judged too quickly, and underestimated the value of experience. Now, she realized that she was helping others to skip that difficult step. The junior officers were being shown, not through reprimand or lectures, but through presence and acknowledgement, the true meaning of respect, courage, and perseverance. By the end of the day, Sarah walked back across the base, her step steady and her heart calm. She had returned to a place that had once felt familiar, yet had changed, just as she had changed. The courtyard, once filled with mockery and whispers, now felt quieter, almost reverent in its own way. The junior officers, reflecting on what they had seen and heard, had begun to understand the deeper meaning behind what they had initially judged as strange or unnecessary. The tattoo on Sarah's arm, which had been a point of amusement at the start of the day, had become something else entirely. It was now a silent reminder of courage, resilience, and the experiences that define a life of service. It was a mark of respect, not just for her accomplishments, but for all those who dedicate themselves to something greater than themselves. Sarah knew that the lesson extended beyond the immediate moment. The junior officers would carry it with them, consciously or unconsciously, as they grew in their own careers, slowly understanding the value of respect, humility, and the stories hidden behind appearances. As the sun began to set over the base, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction. She had come back not only to resume her duties, but to remind others that true service is recognized not through mockery, but through observation, understanding, and acknowledgment. Today, she had quietly taught a lesson that would resonate far longer than the laughter of those who had once judged her. She had returned, stood her ground, and, through her history and presence, transformed the perceptions of those around her. And as she looked one last time at the courtyard, Sarah knew that her journey, both past and present, had left its mark, just as her tattoo had. It was a mark of courage, honor, and resilience, and now, in the eyes of those who had once mocked it, it had become a symbol of respect and inspiration. The young officers had learned that day that true courage and dedication are never diminished by misunderstanding, and that respect is something that must be earned, observed, and ultimately recognized.